Next up, we have the Xander rails on Apple again segment. Two things this week. The top line for this is there's a new app policy in Europe in response to the Digital Markets Act, which is an EU policy meant to regulate how digital marketplaces work. Apple offered a new policy which is compliant. And so this is how it works. App companies can opt for a new commission structure instead of the 30% IAP fee. Great. That sounds great. I hate 30% IAP fees. The fees drop. It is a bunch of variables, but it basically drops between 10 and 20%. However, and this is really, really, really freaking important, any company that has over 1 million users on iOS per year have to pay a 50% core technology fee on the entire user base. And they could never reverse this decision. They have a calculator online, and if you start using the calculator and playing with any variables, this just blows the cost out of the water. It's like multiplicatively more expensive for like the majority of apps to go with this version versus the other version. So it's a pretty crazy policy. It like follows the letter of the law, they think, in terms of following the Digital Markets Act. At least they're posturing that it is, but this is obviously not following the spirit of the law. And I expect there to be more pushback from the EU regulators overall, because I think this is just like really, really disingenuous by Apple.
Well, Xander, Apple estimates that less than 1% of developers will pay this fee. So it's really not a big deal, right?
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, they're smart because they have this small business program, and that is part of how you get to 10% fee structure. Is like if you're in the small business program under 1 million installs, you get 10%, but none of the revenue comes from that segment, right? It all comes from the high end.
And to be clear, I'm being sarcastic because we all know that like the wealth in games is extremely concentrated. So Apple, I think, often touts these somewhat misleading metrics about the number of developers that have to pay the fee rather than the percentage of the ecosystem revenue that they're taking.
Right.
Most mobile games fail. Most mobile games generate like absolutely negligible revenue. And it's a hits-driven business, absolutely. So it might be that 1%, but that 1% might represent 30% of all revenue. Like, I don't actually know what that is, so don't quote me on that. And even though this is based on an EU ruling, Xander, this affects all app developers?
So it's an EU-specific policy. So the ecosystem is fragmenting. We kind of covered this last year on the podcast, but there's specific rules around South Korea. There's now specific rules around the EU. The United States has other rulings, and it's just going to continue to fragment. And basically what this is they just have like an army of lawyers in every geo, like, hold the line. Yeah. How long can we get 30% commission for? And just milk and milk and milk. And there's a reason why they're like the number one cash generating business of all time, or up there, is because they have these types of really aggressive policies.
Got it. Yeah. The wild thing about this that I really fixate on is how it affects player bases in different parts of the world really differently, and actually prevents games from coming to certain markets with this policy. So say that you have a game that's really popular in India and you're a European developer. You're no longer marketing that game in India. And in fact, you might want to delist it from the App Store because the average user value from that market compared to other markets is generally much lower. Yeah. And there's tons of markets where the average LTV of a player is far below 50 cents.
Yeah. Well, you could just pay the 30% IAP fee and not switch over to the new terms. Why change?
It's so
that's
easy.
The entire fucking point of this policy is to make you happy to pay 30%. Yeah. These guys, what the gall. It's really funny. Speaking of Apple and people fighting back, Epic has filed a new notice of non-compliance saying they intend to pursue a motion of contempt of court against Apple in regards to the way that they've enacted their new App Store policy in the US. So taking a step back a little bit, the Supreme Court declined to hear the ruling about Epic versus Apple. What that meant is the lower court's ruling went into effect, and Apple said, okay, fine, you can link out of your apps to do web transactions, but you still have to pay 27% fee. And Epic said, crazy, this is nonsense. They're taking it back to court and hoping to hold them in contempt of court. I love it. Thank you, Epic. Someone's got to fucking do this, and you got the money to do this. And, you know, Tim Sweetie, you are our Lord and Savior. I mean, Warren, any thoughts here? Being a little bit disingenuous, but only a little bit.
Yeah. Once again, I will state, Apple, you are a valued partner of Upptic. We appreciate you letting us launch all of our clients' games on your platform and giving them lots of featuring support. Yeah, we touched on this a little bit last week before this new chapter of Epic versus Apple, but we covered the news of this 27% fee. It really undercuts Apple's thesis of why the fee exists in the first place, which is we are providing a bundle of services for this fee. One of the big ones is smooth, safe payment processing and refunding. And by applying what is essentially the same fee, I mean, 27% versus 30%, come on. And saying like, we actually are going to give you none of those safeguards, and we're actually going to create increased walls and fear in the consumer doing this transaction. But don't worry, we're going to still basically charge the same rate for it.
Yeah. I mean, there's an interesting, so this is how they justify it. What are credit card fees? It's like 2%. Right. So they're like, oh, well, our transaction fee is 3%. The other 27% is just a licensing fee for our IP in this sanctity of our walled garden. So, I mean, I don't buy it. I think it's ridiculous, but that's the market, I guess.